The words "you're fired" had barely left Victoria Hastings' lips when the screaming began, but it wasn't the scream of the man she'd just humiliated in front of the entire office. It was the sound of her own daughter, choking and gasping for air in the executive suite just 30 feet away. And the only person who could save her was the devastated single father, now packing his desk, the one she'd just destroyed without a second thought. Marcus Reed stood frozen at his small maintenance desk on the 15th floor of Hastings Tower, his hands trembling as he held the pink termination slip that Victoria Hastings, CEO, billionaire, and ice queen of the corporate world, had delivered personally, her cold blue eyes never once meeting his as she rattled off accusations about negligence, poor performance, and not fitting the company image, words that cut deeper than any blade, because Marcus knew the truth. He'd been let go because he'd asked for time off to attend his 7-year-old daughter, Zoe's school play, a request that Victoria had deemed unprofessional and indicative of misplaced priorities. The other employees watched in uncomfortable silence as Marcus, a man who arrived an hour early every day, who kept every floor spotless, who smiled at everyone and never complained, quietly began removing the few personal items from his locker: a photo of Zoe in her Sunday dress, a handmade Father's Day card, and a framed certificate from his past life, one that no one here knew about, one that read Marcus Reed, MD, Johns Hopkins University. Victoria had already turned on her designer heels, dismissing him from her mind as easily as she'd dismissed him from her payroll, her thoughts already on the afternoon's board meeting and the multi-million-dollar merger that would cement her legacy. When suddenly, her assistant Rachel burst through the executive suite doors, her face drained of color, her voice cracking with panic. "Miss Hastings, it's Emma. She's choking. She can't breathe. I don't know what to do." Victoria's heart stopped team. Her 8-year-old daughter, her only child, the one soft spot in her otherwise impenetrable armor, and she ran faster than she'd ever run in her Louboutin heels, bursting into her private office, where Emma sat turning blue, her small hands clawing at her throat, her eyes wide with terror as a piece of hard candy lodged deep in her airway, blocking all oxygen. Victoria screamed for someone to call 911, her hands shaking uselessly as she grabbed her daughter, but Emma's lips were already purple, her movements growing weaker, and Victoria realized with soul-crushing horror that her child had maybe 60 seconds before brain damage, maybe 2 minutes before death, and the ambulance was at least 8 minutes away. "Does anyone know CPR? The Heimlich. Please, somebody help my baby." Victoria's voice cracked with a desperation she'd never shown in 38 years of life, the polished veneer of control shattering as she faced the one thing money couldn't fix and power couldn't command, death coming for her daughter. Rachel ran into the hallway screaming for help, and that's when she saw him, Marcus, still on the floor, moving toward the elevator with his cardboard box of belongings, his eyes red but his jaw set with dignity, and, without thinking, she grabbed his arm. "Marcus, please, Emma's choking. She's dying, please." For a split second, Marcus hesitated, remembering the humiliation of 15 minutes ago, remembering how Victoria had called him negligent, how she'd dismissed his daughter's importance, how she'd never once in 2 years asked his name or looked him in the eye. But then he heard the child's weakening gasps, and his doctor's instinct, dormant for 3 years, but never truly gone, exploded into action. Marcus dropped his box and ran, his maintenance uniform still smelling of floor cleaner, his work boots pounding against the marble as he burst into Victoria's office to find her cradling Emma, tears streaming down her face, whispering, "Please don't leave me, baby. Please stay with mommy." Words that Marcus himself had whispered in a hospital room 3 years ago when his wife Sarah died of cancer, leaving him alone with Zoe and a mountain of medical debt that had cost him his practice, his savings, and his career. "Put her down, on the floor, now," Marcus commanded with such authority that Victoria, who never took orders from anyone, immediately complied, laying Emma on the plush carpet as Marcus knelt beside the little girl, his trained hands moving with precision and speed, checking her airway, seeing the obstruction, knowing that traditional Heimlich wouldn't work because the candy was too far down, and Emma was already too weak to generate the necessary force. "She needs an emergency cricothyrotomy," Marcus said, more to himself than Victoria, his mind racing through options: no equipment, no sterile field, no backup, but he'd done this procedure in field conditions during his residency in emergency medicine, and he knew that doing something risky was better than doing nothing and watching this child die. What are you going to do?" Victoria demanded, her control freak nature battling her maternal terror. But Marcus was already removing his belt, sterilizing his small pocket knife with the alcohol from Victoria's desk bar, finding the anatomical landmarks on Emma's tiny throat with fingers that hadn't palpated a patient in 3 years but still remembered every millimeter of human anatomy. "I'm going to make an airway below the blockage," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "It's going to look scary, but it's her only chance. The ambulance won't get here in time." Victoria's eyes went wide with horror and hope, and in that microsecond she made the hardest decision of her life, trusting her daughter's survival to the man she'd just destroyed, the janitor she'd never respected. And she nodded, grabbing Emma's hand and whispering, "Mommy's here, baby, Mommy's here." Marcus worked with the calm precision of the skilled physician he'd once been, making a small incision, using the barrel of a pen to create an airway. And suddenly, miraculously, air was flowing. Emma's chest began to rise and fall, and color started returning to her face. She wasn't conscious, but she was breathing, and breathing meant living. Victoria sobbed with relief, her whole body shaking as she watched this man in a janitor's uniform perform a miracle with a pocket knife and a pen. This man whose name she'd barely known, who she'd humiliated and fired, who had every reason to walk away, but instead had run toward her crisis, had saved her daughter's life without hesitation, without condition, without asking for anything in return. The paramedics arrived 6 minutes later, professional and efficient, carefully transferring Emma to a proper airway tube and loading her into the ambulance, praising Marcus's technique and asking where he'd trained, their respect obvious when he quietly answered Johns Hopkins, class of 2015. Victoria rode in the ambulance, refusing to leave Emma's side, but before the doors closed, she locked eyes with Marcus, still kneeling on her office floor with blood on his hands, and choked out 2 words that felt foreign on her tongue but came from the deepest part of her soul: "Thank you." At the hospital, as Emma was stabilized and admitted for observation, Victoria sat in the waiting room for the first time, understanding what it meant to be powerless, to be terrified, to be dependent on the skill and mercy of another human being. And she couldn't stop thinking about Marcus. Who was he, really? Why had a Johns Hopkins trained physician been working as a janitor in her building? What had she done, firing him without knowing his story, without seeing his humanity? She had her assistant Rachel Hudd been quietly horrified by the firing bring her Marcus's employment file. And as Victoria read through the sparse details, she began to piece together a story. Marcus Reed, age 36, widower, single father to Zoe Reed, age 7. Previous employment gap of 6 months, references from a church and a community clinic, but none from hospitals. And then, because Victoria was nothing if not thorough, she made calls, pulled strings, and discovered the truth. Marcus had been a rising star in emergency medicine, completing a prestigious residency, joining a top practice, marrying his college sweetheart Sarah, and welcoming baby Zoe into the world. But when Sarah was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer, Marcus had done what love demanded. He'd focused everything on her care, taking loans to afford experimental treatments, working extra shifts to pay for specialists, and when she died anyway, He'd been left with a traumatized daughter, crushing debt, and hands that shook too badly to hold a scalpel because grief had broken something inside him. He'd lost his position, sold everything, and taken the only job he could find that offered health insurance for Zoe and didn't require steady hands or emotional stability, cleaning floors in office buildings at night, and he'd done it without complaint for 3 years, slowly rebuilding himself, piece by piece, showing up for his daughter, attending her school events, being present even when the professional world had moved on without him. Victoria sat with this information, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Shame, real and burning, the kind that came from recognizing you'd been cruel to someone who'd already survived. More pain than you could imagine. And when Emma woke up 12 hours later, groggy but alive, asking Mommy, what happened? Victoria held her close and said, an angel saved you, baby, and Mommy needs to make things right. The next morning, Victoria Hastings did something she'd never done. She called an employee, personally, got Marcus's number from HR, and asked if he would meet her at the hospital. Her voice humble in a way her assistant had never heard. Marcus came, not because he wanted anything from Victoria, but because he was a good man who understood that she was a mother who'd almost lost everything. And when he arrived in the hospital room, Emma's face lit up despite the bandages on her throat, and she whispered in a raspy voice, "Are you the one who saved me?" Marcus smiled gently, sitting beside her bed, and said, "I just helped out until the real heroes got there." But Emma, with the clarity that children possess, said, "Mommy told me you were very brave, and that I'm alive because of you." Victoria stood by the window, watching this interaction, seeing Marcus's gentleness with Emma, noticing the way he explained things in simple terms, how he made her laugh, even though it hurt her throat, and she saw in him everything she'd failed to see before: competence, compassion, strength, and a depth of character that her entire board of directors couldn't match. When Emma dozed off, Victoria asked Marcus to join her in the hallway, and there, in the sterile corridor of St. Mary's Hospital, this woman who commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals struggled to find words. "I owe you an apology," Victoria began, her voice tight. "Actually, I owe you more than I can ever repay. You saved Emma's life, and I had just, I had just fired you, humiliated you, and I didn't even know who you were." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then said, "You didn't know because you never asked, Ms. Hastings, but that doesn't matter now. I'm just glad Emma's okay." His words were kind, but they stung because they were true. Victoria had never asked, had never seen him as fully human, had treated him as invisible, and the weight of that truth was crushing. "Why did you help?" Victoria asked, genuinely confused. "I had just destroyed you in front of everyone, questioned your character, ended your employment. You could have walked away, and no one would have blamed you." Marcus met her eyes, and for the first time, Victoria really looked at him, really saw the man behind the uniform, the pain behind the steady gaze, the strength behind the gentleness. "And," he said, "because a child was dying, and I'm a father before I'm anything else, and I couldn't let another parent feel what I felt when I lost my wife, that helplessness, that grief, not if I could prevent it." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, something her colleagues would have paid money to witness, and she said, "Tell me your story, Marcus. Please, I want to understand." So Marcus told her, there in the hospital hallway, about Sarah and Zoe, about medical school and lost dreams, about debt and grief and starting over, about choosing his daughter over his career, about cleaning floors with a medical degree because love meant sacrifice. And Victoria listened without interrupting, her heart breaking and expanding simultaneously, realizing that she'd been so focused on building an empire that she'd forgotten to build a relationship with her own daughter, that she'd been so obsessed with success that she'd lost sight of significance. "I want to offer you your job back," Victoria said when he finished, But Marcus shook his head, and she quickly added, "No, not maintenance, your real job, the one you trained for. I want you to run the medical team for Hastings Corporation, develop our employee health program, use your gifts the way they were meant to be used." Marcus stared at her, shocked, and said, "Ms. Hastings, I haven't practiced in 3 years. I'm not even sure I could." But Victoria interrupted. "You saved my daughter's life with a pocket knife and a pen. Marcus, you're the most competent physician I've ever seen, and I'm not taking no for an answer. UNLESS. She paused, vulnerable for the first time. "Unless you can't forgive me for how I treated you." Marcus thought about forgiveness, about how Sarah used to say that holding grudges was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. And he thought about Zoe and the future he could give her with a real salary and purpose. And he thought about this broken woman in front of him who'd been humbled by crisis and was genuinely trying to make amends. And he said, "I forgive you, Ms. Hastings, and I accept your offer. But on one condition: you have dinner with Emma, at least 3 times a week. No phones, no work, just you and her." Victoria laughed through her tears and said, "Deal, and please, call me Victoria." 3 months later, Marcus Reed, MD, was running the most innovative corporate health program in the country, had paid off his debts, and was watching Zoe perform in her school play from the front row. And sitting next to him, also in the front row, were Victoria and Emma Hastings, who'd become unexpected friends with the Reed family, bonded by crisis and transformed by grace. Victoria had stepped back from 70-hour work weeks, had learned her daughter's favorite color, purple, and biggest fear, disappointing her mother, and had started a foundation providing medical care for families in debt, naming it Sarah's Hope, after the woman whose death had inadvertently taught her about life. On the night of Zoe's play, as the children took their bows and the parents applauded, Marcus leaned over to Victoria and said, "You know, getting fired was the worst and best thing that ever happened to me." And Victoria replied, "Nearly losing Emma was the worst and best thing that happened to me. Funny how crisis reveals what really matters." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people from completely different worlds who'd been brought together by emergency and transformed by empathy. And as the lights came up and the children ran to their parents, Emma grabbed Zoe's hand and they raced toward Marcus and Victoria together. And in that moment, Victoria understood the truth that had eluded her for 38 years. Success isn't measured by what you build, but by who you become. And the greatest achievement of her life wasn't any merger or acquisition. It was learning to see people like Marcus, to value humans over profits, to love her daughter more than her legacy, and to understand that sometimes the people we dismiss hold the very gifts we need, if only we have the humility to look, the courage to apologize, and the wisdom to change. The story of Marcus and Victoria spread through Hastings Corporation, becoming a legend about second chances and human dignity. And though Victoria never publicized what happened that day, every employee noticed the change: the way she learned their names, asked about their families, created childcare support and flexible scheduling, transformed the culture from cutthroat to compassionate. And they noticed that the brilliant doctor who ran their medical team treated everyone with the same gentleness and respect, from the CEO to the new maintenance worker who'd taken Marcus's old position, a young immigrant named Ahmed, who Marcus personally mentored, paying forward the grace he'd received. Years later, when Emma graduated from medical school, inspired by the man who'd saved her life, Marcus stood in the crowd with tears in his eyes, and Victoria whispered, "None of this would have happened if you hadn't been exactly who you are on the worst day of my life." And Marcus replied, "And I wouldn't be here if you hadn't been brave enough to change." And they both understood that redemption is always possible, that people can transform, that crisis can be the birthplace of compassion, and that sometimes the greatest miracle isn't the dramatic rescue, it's the quiet decision to forgive, to grow, to see the humanity in others, and to let yourself be changed by those you once refused to see.